I stared at my phone screen reading the text from Grandma for the third time. My hands trembled as the words burned into my mind. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about Christmas, about the past 20 years, had just shattered. My 6-year-old daughter Sarah was still asleep in her bed, clutching the drawing she made of the doll she never got. My 8-year-old son Jake hadn't spoken since we left my parents' house yesterday. The truth Grandma revealed would change everything forever. The phone call came exactly 1 week before Christmas. I was balanced precariously on our stepladder, wrestling with a string of lights that seemed determined to tangle itself around every branch of our 7-foot Douglas fir. Emma was below me, untangling another strand while humming along to the Christmas music playing softly from our old radio. Sarah and Jake were sprawled on the living room carpet, meticulously arranging our collection of handmade ornaments by color and size. Our modest ranch house in Columbus, Ohio wasn't much to look at from the outside, but during the holidays, Emma transformed it into something magical. She had this gift for making our small space feel warm and welcoming, even on our tight budget. The mantel was draped with garland she'd woven herself, dotted with red velvet ribbons, and battery-operated fairy lights. Our coffee table held plates of cookies the kids had helped bake, and the smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled every corner of the house. When my phone rang, I almost didn't answer it. My dad wasn't much for casual conversation, and our relationship had always been cordial but distant. I was the reliable son who showed up for every holiday, helped fix whatever needed repairing around their property, and never caused any drama. My brother Chris, on the other hand, lived in Silicon Valley, worked for some tech company, and made what I assumed was decent money, based on the stories he shared during his rare visits home to Michigan. "Lou, how are things going over there?" Dad's voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost excited. "Good, Dad. Just decorating the tree with the family. What's up, Well, your mother and I were talking, and we wanted to get an early start on Christmas shopping this year. We thought it might be nice to ask the kids directly what they're hoping for." I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This was new territory for my parents. Usually, they'd give the kids practical gifts like clothes or books, nothing too extravagant, but always thoughtful. The fact that they wanted to hear directly from Sarah and Jake felt like a sign that maybe our relationship was evolving. "Sarah, Jake, come here. Grandpa wants to talk to you about Christmas." The transformation was immediate. Both kids scrambled to their feet and raced over to where I stood holding the phone. Their faces lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children can manage, their eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Can we really tell him what we want?" Sarah whispered, bouncing on her toes. I put the phone on speaker and watched my children's excitement bubble over. Sarah went first, her words tumbling out in a rush of enthusiasm. "Grandpa, I really want the American Girl doll named Molly. She has brown hair like me, and she comes with these amazing historical outfits from the 1940s. There's this blue dress with a white collar, and she has these tiny black shoes with real buckles and—" Jake interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer. "And I want the remote control helicopter that I saw on TV. It has a camera on it, so you can take pictures from up in the sky, and it can fly for 15 whole minutes before the battery runs out and—" Dad chuckled on the other end of the line. "Slow down, you two. I want to make sure I get all the details right." For the next 20 minutes, my children provided the most thorough Christmas wish list I'd ever heard. They described colors, sizes, specific model numbers they'd memorized from commercials. Sarah explained that Molly came with a lunchbox and tiny books, and Jake detailed the exact specifications of the helicopter's camera capabilities. "Those sound like wonderful choices," Dad said when they finally finished. "Would you kids mind drawing pictures of what you want? That way Grandma and I can make sure we get exactly the right things." Sarah gasped with delight. "We can draw them right now." After Dad hung up, the kids spent the rest of the afternoon creating the most elaborate wish pictures I'd ever seen. Sarah drew herself sitting in her bedroom holding Molly, both of them wearing matching blue dresses. She used every colored pencil in her set, adding details like the doll's tiny socks and the pattern on her dress. In careful block letters, she wrote, "Thank you, Grandpa," at the bottom. Jake's drawing was equally detailed. He sketched our house from above with the helicopter hovering nearby. He drew little circles to represent the camera lens and added motion lines to show the propeller spinning. He even included a speech bubble coming from the helicopter with "Zoom" written inside. Emma helped them scan the pictures using our old printer, and we emailed them to my parents that evening. The kids were so proud of their artwork they could barely sit still during dinner. "Do you think Grandpa will really get them?" Sarah asked as I tucked her into bed. "Grandpa loves you very much," I replied, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Whatever happens, just remember that Christmas is about being together as a family." As I turned off her bedroom light, I felt genuinely optimistic about the upcoming holiday. My parents had seemed more engaged with the grandchildren than ever before, and seeing my kids' happiness made me believe this Christmas might be different. Better. 3 days before Christmas, I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard voices from the kitchen. The window was cracked open and my parents' conversation drifted outside clearly. "We need to make sure Chris's visit goes perfectly this time," Mom was saying. "You know how he gets when things aren't exactly right." "I know, Dorothy, we can't disappoint him again, not after last year." Something in their tone made me pause, wrench still in hand. There was an urgency there, almost anxiety, that I'd never heard before when they talked about family visits. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was reading too much into a casual conversation. Chris was successful and busy. Of course, they wanted his visit to go smoothly, but the worry in their voices lingered in my mind as I finished organizing the garage. That night, as Emma and I wrapped the small gifts we'd managed to afford for the kids and my parents, I mentioned what I'd overheard. "Maybe they're just excited to see Chris," Emma suggested. "He doesn't visit very often." "Yeah, you're probably right," I agreed, but something still felt off. My parents had never seemed anxious about holiday visits before. We always had a good time, even if Chris could be a bit self-centered when he was around. The next morning, Jacob woke us up before dawn, too excited to sleep. Christmas Eve had finally arrived, and both kids were practically vibrating with anticipation. "Only one more sleep," Sarah announced over breakfast, as if we weren't already counting down the hours. We spent Christmas Eve at our house following our own small traditions. We watched classic holiday movies, made hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and let the kids open one present each. Sarah got new Christmas pajamas with reindeer on them, and Jake received a book about airplanes. As I watched my children's faces glowing in the light of our Christmas tree, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Whatever expensive gifts my parents might have waiting for them tomorrow, this moment right here was what Christmas was really about. Family togetherness and the simple joy of being loved. I had no idea how wrong I was about to be proven. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear in Columbus. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering our neighborhood in a pristine white blanket that made everything look like a postcard. Sarah and Jake burst into our bedroom at 6:30 in the morning, still wearing their Christmas pajamas and bouncing with excitement. "Can we leave for Grandma and Grandpa's now?" Sarah begged, climbing onto our bed. "It's a 3-hour drive, sweetie." Emma laughed, pulling her close. "We need to eat breakfast first, and they're not expecting us until 11. The drive to my parents' house in Grand Rapids, Michigan was filled with Christmas carols and eager chatter from the back seat. Jake practiced his thank you speech for the helicopter, while Sarah sang lullabies to the small doll she'd brought along to keep Molly company. They'd both dressed in their nicest clothes, without being asked, wanting to look perfect for their grandparents. "Do you think Tommy will like the present we made him?" Sarah asked as we crossed the Michigan state line. She was referring to the handmade photo album they'd created for their 7-year-old cousin, filled with pictures from family gatherings and decorated with stickers and drawings. It had taken them hours to put together, and they were incredibly proud of their work. "He's going to love it," I assured her, glancing at their excited faces in the rearview mirror. My parents' house sat on 2 acres of property just outside Grand Rapids, a white colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch. Mom had always gone overboard with Christmas decorations, and this year was no exception. Lights outlined every window and draped across the porch railings. An enormous wreath hung on the front door, and inflatable snowmen dotted the front yard. As we pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed Chris's silver rental car was already parked near the house. He must have flown in early from California, which was unusual for him. Normally, he arrived just in time for dinner and left the next morning. Dad met us at the front door, but something seemed different about his demeanor. He hugged the kids warmly enough, but kept checking his watch and looking over his shoulder toward the living room. "Chris and Jennifer and Tommy are already here," he said, referring to my brother's wife. "They got in last night." Mom appeared in the hallway wearing her best Christmas sweater and a smile that looked somehow forced. She immediately swept Tommy into her arms as soon as he appeared, exclaiming loudly about how much he'd grown since last year. Tommy looked well. Better than well, actually. He was wearing clothes I'd never seen before, expensive-looking jeans and a designer sweater that probably cost more than I spent on both my kids' entire wardrobes. New sneakers that looked like they belonged in an athletic store advertisement completed his outfit. "Uncle Lou," Chris appeared with his characteristic broad smile and firm handshake. "Good to see you, man. How's the construction business treating you?" There was something in his tone that rankled me, a subtle condescension that I'd noticed increasingly over the years. He had a way of asking about my work that made it sound like he was talking to someone who'd failed to achieve their potential. "Things are good," I replied. "Steady work, good crew. Can't complain." Chris nodded absently, already turning his attention back to Tommy, who was showing off what appeared to be the latest model iPad. I'd been saving for months, hoping to get Jake a basic tablet for his reading difficulties, but it was still beyond our budget. We gathered in the living room, where Mom had outdone herself with decorations. The 12-foot Christmas tree dominated one corner, covered in ornaments she'd been collecting for decades. Presents were stacked high underneath, wrapped in coordinated paper and elaborate bows. "Should we start opening gifts?" Mom suggested, though it was barely noon, and we usually waited until after Christmas dinner. "Yes," all three kids chorused, rushing to sit near the tree. What followed was the most uncomfortable gift-opening session I'd ever experienced. Tommy went first, unwrapping present after present with increasing excitement. Video games I recognized from expensive commercials. The newest gaming console that had been sold out everywhere for months. Clothes from brands I'd only seen in department store windows. Sarah and Jake sat politely watching their cousin's mountain of gifts grow higher and higher. I noticed Jake's hands fidgeting in his lap, and Sarah kept glancing toward the tree, hopefully. "This is so cool," Tommy exclaimed, holding up a remote-controlled drone that looked significantly more advanced than the helicopter Jake had wished for. Chris beamed with pride, taking pictures with his expensive camera. "We figured he was old enough for the good stuff now." Jennifer nodded approvingly. We wanted to make sure he had the best Christmas possible. After what felt like an hour, Tommy's gift opening seemed to wind down. Sarah shifted forward hopefully. "Grandma, do you think maybe there are some presents for me and Jake?" Mom's face flushed slightly. "Oh, well, there might be a few more things behind the tree." She disappeared around the massive evergreen and returned with 2 small packages. Sarah unwrapped hers to find a generic coloring book and a small box of crayons. Jake's gift was a paperback book about cars. The disappointment on their faces was heartbreaking, but they maintained their politeness beautifully. "Thank you, Grandma," Sarah said quietly, though I could see tears forming in her eyes. That's when I noticed it. Behind Tommy, partially hidden by wrapping paper and ribbon, sat a familiar-looking box. As I focused on it, my blood began to chill. It was the American Girl doll box. The specific Molly doll that Sarah had drawn in such careful detail. The exact one from her picture. My eyes scanned the remaining unwrapped gifts around Tommy, and there it was. The remote control helicopter with camera attachment that Jake had researched so thoroughly, still in its original packaging. "Tommy, looks like Santa brought you a few more surprises," Chris said, following my gaze. "What are those?" Tommy asked, genuinely curious, as he reached for the doll box. "This one's some kind of historical doll," Chris said, reading the package. And this helicopter has a camera. Pretty cool stuff. I watched in stunned silence as my nephew unwrapped the exact gifts my children had requested, had drawn pictures of, had dreamed about for weeks. The helicopter that Jake had memorized every specification for. The doll that Sarah had carefully researched and fallen in love with. Sarah started crying quietly, trying to hide her tears behind her hands. Jake stared at the helicopter in Tommy's lap with an expression of complete confusion. "Daddy," Sarah whispered, tugging on my sleeve, "why did Grandpa give Tommy our presents?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the room at my family, waiting for someone to explain, to laugh, and say there had been a mix-up. That, of course, there were gifts for Sarah and Jake. Instead, Chris was helping Tommy figure out how the helicopter's camera worked. Mom was bustling around collecting wrapping paper. Dad had disappeared entirely, probably into his workshop, like he always did when situations became uncomfortable. Only Emma seemed to understand what was happening. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at my parents with an expression of complete disbelief. "Come on, kids," I said quietly, standing up. "Let's get our coats." "Are we leaving already?" Mom asked, looking up from her wrapping paper collection. "But we haven't had dinner yet." "We need to go," I replied, helping Sarah to her feet. "Lou, don't be dramatic," Chris said without looking up from the helicopter controls. "Kids need to learn that Christmas isn't just about getting presents." That comment broke something inside me. I guided my children to the front hallway, helped them into their coats, and collected the small gifts we'd brought for my parents. Emma followed silently, her jaw set in a way that told me she was furious. "Lou, wait," Mom called out as we reached the door. "Let's talk about this." But I was done talking. I was done pretending. I was done watching my children's hearts break while my brother's child played with the gifts that had been specifically requested by my kids. We drove home in silence. Sarah cried quietly in her car seat, and Jake stared out the window without speaking. Emma reached over and squeezed my hand, but neither of us knew what to say. The worst part wasn't even the missing gifts. It was the realization that this hadn't been an accident or oversight. Someone had deliberately taken my children's Christmas lists and given every single item to Tommy. Someone had looked at those carefully drawn pictures and decided that my kids didn't deserve the things they'd wished for. That night, after we'd tucked the children into bed with extra hugs and promises that we'd figure out a way to make Christmas special, I sat in our living room, staring at our modest tree. The presents underneath suddenly looked pathetic compared to the mountain of gifts Tommy had received. "I don't understand," Emma said, curling up next to me on the couch. "How could they do that to Sarah and Jake? How could they be so cruel?" "I don't know," I replied, but somewhere deep in my mind, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form. As I drifted off to sleep that night, one question kept echoing in my mind. Why would my parents hurt my children to benefit my brother's child? What could possibly motivate them to be so deliberately hurtful? I was about to find out that the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. I woke up to the insistent buzzing of my phone on the nightstand. The digital clock read 5:47 a.m., and bright winter sunlight was streaming through our bedroom curtains. Emma stirred next to me, mumbling something about the early hour. 17 missed calls, all from my family. The call log showed a progression of increasing desperation. Dad had called first at 5 a.m., then again 10 minutes later. Mom had tried 3 times. Chris had left 4 voicemails. Even Jennifer had called twice. I scrolled through the voicemails with growing irritation. Dad's first message was casual, almost dismissive. "Lou, not sure why you folks left so early yesterday. Give me a call when you get this." By his third message, the tone had shifted. "Son, your mother is upset about how things ended. We need to talk this through like adults." Message number 7 was angry. "Lou, this is ridiculous. You're being completely dramatic over nothing. Call me back immediately." Chris's messages were typical of his personality. The first one was condescending. "Hey, little brother. I think you might have misunderstood something yesterday. Let's clear the air." His final message was nastier. "Lou, you're acting like a child. You need to think about what kind of example you're setting for Sarah and Jake. Christmas isn't about material things, and the sooner they learn that, the better. Stop being selfish and call our parents back. Mom's last voicemail was tearful and guilt-inducing. Lou, honey, I don't understand what happened. We love you and the children so much. Please don't let a misunderstanding ruin our family Christmas. Call me back. We can fix this. I was about to delete the messages when my phone buzzed with a new text. The sender was listed as Grandma Betty, though I rarely heard from my 78-year-old grandmother, except on birthdays and major holidays. The message was short, but it made my stomach drop to the floor. Lou, I had to tell you, your father used your kids' Christmas list to buy presents for Chris's family. He said Chris threatened to never visit again if Tommy didn't have the best Christmas ever. There's more you need to know about the inheritance. Meet me at Denny's on Oak Street at 10 a.m. Come alone. Love, Grandma Betty. I read the text 3 times each reading, making the words feel more surreal. My father had intentionally given Tommy the gifts meant for Sarah and Jake. But the part about the inheritance made no sense. What inheritance? My grandfather had died when I was 12, and as far as I knew, there hadn't been any significant money involved. Emma found me in the kitchen 20 minutes later, still staring at the phone and trying to process what I'd read. Lou, you look like you've seen a ghost. I showed her the text message. She read it twice, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. He did it on purpose, she whispered. Your father deliberately stole our kids' Christmas presents. That's what it says. But Emma, there's more. Something about an inheritance that I don't understand. What inheritance? I have no idea. That's why I need to meet with Grandma Betty. Emma started pacing around our small kitchen, her anger building with each step. I want to drive over there right now and confront your parents. I want to demand an explanation for what they did to Sarah and Jake. I know, I feel the same way, but first I need to understand what Grandma Betty is talking about. There's something bigger going on here. I spent the next 2 hours trying to act normal for the kids while my mind raced with questions. Sarah was quiet during breakfast, picking at her pancakes and avoiding eye contact. Jake barely spoke, which was unusual for my normally chatty son. Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at us? Sarah finally asked. The question broke my heart. No, sweetie, they're not mad at you. Sometimes adults make mistakes and we need to figure out how to fix them. At 9:30, I told Emma I was going to run some errands and would be back by lunch. I hated lying to her, but I didn't want to get her hopes up or make her more angry until I understood what Grandma Betty had to tell me. The Denny's on Oak Street was a familiar landmark from my childhood, a place where Grandma Betty used to take Chris and me for pancakes when we visited her apartment across town. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in a corner booth nursing a cup of coffee and trying to prepare myself for whatever revelation was coming. Grandma Betty arrived precisely at 10, looking older and more frail than I remembered. She was carrying a manila envelope and a worn leather journal that I'd never seen before. Lou, honey, she said, sliding into the booth across from me. Her voice was shaky and she looked like she hadn't slept well. Grandma, what's this about, your text this morning? I don't understand what you meant about an inheritance. She opened the leather journal, revealing pages of handwritten notes, dates, and numbers. Her handwriting was meticulous, documenting what appeared to be financial transactions going back years. Your grandfather left money when he died, Lou? Quite a bit of money. It was supposed to be split equally between you and Chris when your parents passed away, but they've been taking from your portion for years to support Chris's lifestyle. I stared at the journal, trying to process what she was telling me. What do you mean, taking from my portion? Your inheritance was originally worth $250,000. There's about $30,000 left. The number hit me like a physical blow. $250,000. That was more money than I'd ever imagined having. That was college funds for my kids, a house with a real yard, financial security I'd never dared dream about. Where did the rest go? Grandma Betty's eyes filled with tears as she opened the manila envelope and spread bank statements across the table. Chris's house down payment, his wedding expenses, Tommy's private school tuition, their family vacations, Your parents have been giving him money for everything, telling themselves they'd pay it back someday. I picked up one of the bank statements, a transfer for $35,000 made just 2 years ago. The memo line read, Chris, house renovation. I don't understand. Why would they take my money to give to Chris? Because Chris threatened them, Lou. Every time he visits, he demands more financial help. He tells them he's struggling, that he might have to declare bankruptcy, that he won't be able to visit anymore if they don't help him out. Your parents panic and give him whatever he asks for. But why my money specifically? Grandma Betty's face crumpled with guilt. Because they told Chris that you were doing fine on your own. They said you preferred a simple lifestyle, that you didn't need the inheritance money because you were happy with less. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced. My parents had painted me as someone who was content with struggle, who didn't aspire to anything better, who didn't deserve financial security. Meanwhile, they'd used my inheritance to fund Chris's privileged lifestyle. The Christmas presents, I said slowly, that was part of this, wasn't it? Chris demanded that Tommy have the best Christmas ever. He said if your parents couldn't manage that one simple thing, he'd know they didn't really care about his family. So they used your children's wish lists to make sure Tommy got exactly what he wanted. I thought about Sarah's carefully drawn picture of herself hugging the Molly doll. I thought about Jake's detailed research into helicopter specifications. They'd provided a shopping list for their own cousin's Christmas presents. How long have you known about this? I discovered it 6 months ago when I was helping your father organize his financial papers for tax season. I've been agonizing over whether to tell you ever since. But after seeing what they did to Sarah and Jake yesterday, she shook her head. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I studied the bank statement, seeing a pattern of transfers that stretched back over 15 years. Money for Chris's college loans, money for his first apartment, money for his car, money for his wedding, money for everything, while I'd worked double shifts, and Emma had clipped coupons, and we'd worried about affording basic things for our children. Is this legal? Can they just take inheritance money like this? No, Lou. What they've done constitutes financial abuse and fraud. I have documentation of every transaction. We could pursue criminal charges if we wanted to. What about Chris? Does he know where the money is really coming from? And Grandma Betty nodded grimly. He knows. He's known all along that it was your inheritance money. In fact, he's the one who suggested they borrow against your portion instead of his. That revelation was the final blow. Chris hadn't just benefited from the theft of my inheritance, he'd orchestrated it. He'd convinced our parents that I didn't deserve the money, that I was somehow less worthy of financial security than he was. What do I do now? I asked. You have options, honey. You can confront them privately and demand repayment. You can expose everything to the extended family. Or you can pursue legal action. I'll support whatever decision you make. As we sat in that Denny's booth surrounded by evidence of 15 years of betrayal, my phone started ringing. Chris's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Grandma Betty, then answered the call and put it on speaker. Lou, thank God. Look, I think there might have been some confusion yesterday about the Christmas presents. Jennifer and I were thinking maybe the kids would like to come over this afternoon and play with Tommy's new toys. Share a little bit. The condescending tone in his voice, the casual way he offered to let my children play with the gifts that had been meant for them ignited a rage I'd never felt before. That's very generous of you, Chris, I replied, my voice steady despite the fury building inside me. Actually, I'd love to come over and talk about Christmas presents, and maybe a few other things while we're at it. Great, how about 2 o'clock, yo? See you then? I hung up and looked at Grandma Betty. I think it's time my family and I had an honest conversation. What are you going to do? I'm going to get my children's inheritance back. And I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else's kids. For the first time since receiving that devastating text message, I felt a sense of purpose instead of just pain. Chris thought he was dealing with the same passive, accommodating little brother he'd manipulated for years. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Grandma Betty and I spent another hour at Denny's going through every document in her manila envelope. The scope of the financial betrayal was staggering. Bank statements showed regular transfers to Chris totaling over $200,000 across 15 years. There were receipts, emails between my parents discussing how to hide the transactions from me, and even a handwritten note from Chris requesting another advance on Lou's portion for Tommy's private school tuition. He calls it an advance, my Grandma Betty said, pointing to the note, as if he ever intended to pay it back. The most damning evidence was a series of emails from 3 years ago. Chris had been pressuring our parents to give him money for a kitchen renovation, and Dad had hesitated because they'd already given him so much. Chris's response was chilling. Dad Lou doesn't need that inheritance money. Look at his life. He's happy working construction and living in that little house. He doesn't have big dreams like I do. You'd be wasting that money on someone who wouldn't even appreciate it. Lou is simple. He doesn't want the complications that come with wealth. My father's response had been even worse. You're right, son. Lou has always been content with less. We'll transfer another $40,000 this week. I read those emails 3 times, feeling my chest tighten with each word. My own family had decided I was too simple to deserve financial security. They'd characterized my contentment with our modest lifestyle as evidence that I didn't deserve better. There's something else you need to know, Grandma Betty said softly. This isn't the first time they've favored Chris over you. She opened to a different section of her journal, revealing what appeared to be a decades-long pattern of favoritism. Chris had received a car for his 16th birthday while I got a job application to the local garage. Chris's college expenses were fully paid while I took out student loans that I was still paying off. When Chris got married, our parents paid for an elaborate wedding. When Emma and I got married, they offered to contribute $50 toward the reception. I always thought Chris was just more successful, I said, staring at the documentation. I thought he'd earned all these advantages through hard work. Your parents created his success by funding it with your inheritance, Grandma Betty replied. They gave him the down payment for his house, then told everyone how well he was doing in California. They paid for his advanced degree, then bragged about his education. Everything Chris has achieved has been subsidized by the money that should have secured your children's future. The personal betrayal was devastating, but the impact on Sarah and Jake made it unbearable. While Chris's son enjoyed private school and designer clothes and elaborate Christmas presents, my children had gone without because their inheritance was funding their cousin's privileged lifestyle. What about the rest of the family? I asked. Does anyone else know about this? Your Aunt Carol and Uncle Mark have suspected something for years. They've commented to me privately about how strange it was that Chris seemed so successful while never appearing to work very hard. They've also noticed how differently your parents treat your children compared to Tommy. That revelation was both comforting and embarrassing. If other family members had noticed the favoritism, then it wasn't just in my imagination. But it also meant that my children's second-class treatment had been obvious to everyone except me. I need to make some copies of these documents, I said, gathering the papers. I've already made copies for you, Grandma Betty replied, sliding another envelope across the table. Lou, I want you to know that your grandfather would be furious if he knew what your parents had done with his money. He specifically wrote in his will that both his grandsons should have equal opportunities in life. As I drove home with the evidence of my family's 15-year deception, I felt my perspective on our entire relationship shifting. Every holiday gathering where I'd felt vaguely inferior to Chris took on new meaning. Every time our parents had praised Chris's accomplishments while minimizing mine suddenly made sense. The house was quiet when I arrived. Emma was reading in the living room while the kids played upstairs. She looked up expectantly as I walked in. How did it go? I sat down next to her and handed her the envelope of documents. It's worse than we thought. Much worse. Emma spent 20 minutes reading through the evidence while I explained what Grandma Betty had told me. Her expression shifted from confusion to anger to absolute fury. They stole over $200,000 from you, she said finally. From us, from Sarah and Jake's future. And Chris knew about it the entire time. He's the one who convinced them that I didn't deserve the money. That bastard, Emma whispered. All those years he acted like he was so successful and it was all funded with your inheritance. I'm going over to confront them this afternoon. Chris is expecting me at 2 o'clock to discuss the Christmas present situation. I'm coming with you. Emma, I think I should handle this alone first if things get ugly. If things get ugly, I want to be there to protect you. This is our family's future we're talking about. Those documents represent Sarah and Jake's college funds, our retirement security, everything we've never been able to provide for them. She was right, of course. This wasn't just about me. It was about our children's stolen opportunities and our family's financial future. What's our strategy? I asked. We go in with the evidence and demand immediate repayment. If they refuse, we file criminal charges for financial fraud and elder abuse. The thought of potentially sending my own parents to jail was sickening, but the alternative was accepting that my children's inheritance had been stolen to fund my nephew's privileged lifestyle. At 1:30, Emma and I left the kids with our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, telling them we had some errands to run. I hated lying to Sarah and Jake, but I didn't want them to witness what might turn into a very ugly confrontation. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal. I'd made this trip hundreds of times over the years, for family dinners, holiday celebrations, and weekend visits. Never before had I been going there to confront them about financial fraud. Chris's rental car was still in the driveway along with what appeared to be a new luxury SUV that must have belonged to Jennifer. As we walked to the front door, I noticed expensive-looking luggage visible through the car windows, designer brands that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Dad answered the door with a nervous smile. Lou, Emma, good to see you. Come on in. The house felt different somehow, as if seeing it through the lens of financial deception had changed its entire atmosphere. The expensive furniture I'd always assumed they'd saved up for now seemed like evidence of their theft. The elaborate Christmas decorations felt obscene, knowing they'd been funded with my children's inheritance money. Where is everyone? Emma asked. Chris and Jennifer took Tommy to the mall. They should be back soon. Your mother is in the kitchen making coffee. I followed Dad into the living room, where the remnants of yesterday's gift opening were still visible. Tommy's mountain of presents had been organized into neat piles, a display of excess that now made me nauseous. Dad, we need to talk, I said, settling onto the couch with Emma beside me. Of course, son. I'm glad you came back. Yesterday got a little confusing, and I think we all said things we didn't mean. Actually, I think yesterday revealed exactly what everyone meant. Dad's expression shifted slightly, a wariness creeping into his eyes. I'm not sure what you're getting at. That's when I pulled out the manila envelope and spread Grandma Betty's documentation across the coffee table. Bank statements, transfer records, emails, and receipts created an undeniable paper trail of financial fraud. I'm getting at this, I said quietly. 15 years of stealing my inheritance to fund Chris's lifestyle. Dad's face went completely white. He stared at the documents without speaking, his hands trembling slightly as the full scope of his deception was laid bare before him. Mom appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of coffee cups, took one look at the papers spread across the table and dropped the entire tray. The crash of breaking china echoed through the house like a gunshot. Oh no, she whispered. Oh no, oh no, oh no. $250,000, Emma said, her voice ice cold. That was Lou's inheritance. Where did it go? The front door opened before either of my parents could answer. Chris's voice carried from the hallway as he helped Tommy with shopping bags. We got him some great stuff at the toy store, he was saying to Jennifer. I figured since he was so good about sharing his Christmas presents yesterday. He appeared in the living room doorway and immediately noticed the tension. His eyes fell on the documents scattered across the coffee table, and his confident expression faltered. What's going on here? He asked. We're discussing your financial arrangements with Mom and Dad, I replied, standing up. Specifically, how you've been living off my children's inheritance for the past 15 years. Chris's face went through a series of expressions, surprise calculation, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Finally," he said, walking fully into the room. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." The casual way he admitted it, as if the theft of my inheritance was just a minor inconvenience that had finally been discovered, ignited a rage I'd never experienced before. "You knew," I said, "you knew it was my money the entire time?" "Of course I knew. I'm the one who suggested they borrow against your portion instead of mine." "Borrow?" Emma stood up, her voice shaking with fury. "You never intended to pay it back." Chris shrugged. "Look, Lou, you've always been happy with less. You've got your little house, your construction job, your simple life. This money means more to me because I can actually do something significant with it." "Significant like what? Designer clothes for Tommy private school tuition, elaborate vacations?" "I'm building a future," Chris said defensively. "I'm creating opportunities. You would have just put that money in a savings account and let it sit there. That money could have paid for Sarah's medical bills when she needed surgery. It could have helped Jake with his learning disabilities. It could have given our children the same opportunities Tommy has had." "Your kids are fine," Chris said dismissively. "They don't need expensive things to be happy." That's when I lost control. 15 years of suppressed resentment, 15 years of watching my children go without, while their cousin was lavished with stolen resources. 15 years of feeling inferior to my brother's apparent success, all exploded at once. "Those expensive things were bought with their inheritance?" I shouted. "Tommy's private school, his designer clothes, his toys, his college fund, all of it was stolen from Sarah and Jake." Chris actually had the audacity to laugh. "Lou, calm down. This is exactly why Mom and Dad made the right decision. You're too emotional to handle money responsibly." "Chris, stop." Dad finally found his voice. "Just stop talking." "Why should I stop? It's about time someone told Lou the truth. He's never been able to compete with me. So Mom and Dad decided to invest their resources where they do the most good." Emma stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Invest, you mean steal. What you've all done is commit financial fraud." "Oh, please," Chris scoffed. "It's family money. No one was really harmed." No one was harmed. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of Sarah crying quietly on Christmas morning. "Look at my daughter's face and tell me no one was harmed." For the first time, Chris's confidence seemed to waver slightly. But then he doubled down. "Kids recover from disappointment, Lou. It builds character. You're going to pay back every penny," I said quietly. "Every single dollar you stole from my children." Chris laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "And if I don't," I pulled out the copies of Grandma Betty's documentation and set them on the coffee table. "Then I'll file criminal charges for financial fraud and elder abuse. I'll make sure every person in this town knows how you built your success by stealing from your own nephews and niece." "You wouldn't dare," Chris said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Try me." For several long moments, we stood there facing each other while my parents looked on in horror. Then Chris's expression shifted into something uglier. "You know what, Lou? Go ahead and try. I'll claim the entire inheritance was a gift, not theft. I'll say you're making false accusations because you're jealous of my success. Who do you think people will believe? The successful businessman or the bitter construction worker?" That's when Uncle Mark's voice came from the doorway. "They'll believe the legal documents that prove you're a liar." We all turned to see Uncle Mark and Aunt Carol standing in the hallway, having entered through the unlocked front door. Uncle Mark was holding his own manila envelope. "Betty called us and explained what was happening," Aunt Carol said. "We brought copies of your grandfather's original will and the trust documentation. Everything is very clear about how the inheritance was supposed to be distributed." Uncle Mark, who had retired from practicing law 5 years earlier, spread his documents next to mine. "Chris, claiming the inheritance was a gift won't work when we have 15 years of documentation showing your parents explicitly stated they were borrowing against Lou's portion with the intention of paying it back." Chris's face had gone pale. "Uncle Mark, this is a family matter. You don't need to get involved." I became involved the moment you decided to steal my nephew's children's inheritance," Uncle Mark replied coldly. "And just so we're all clear, what you've done here constitutes multiple felonies under Michigan state law." The room fell silent except for the sound of Mom crying softly in her chair. Dad was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, finding my voice again. "You have 60 days to return every penny of the stolen inheritance with interest. You'll also provide written apologies to Sarah and Jake explaining that their Christmas presents were given to Tommy by mistake." "And if I refuse?" Chris asked. "Then Uncle Mark files criminal charges tomorrow morning, and I make sure every person in your professional and social circle knows exactly how you funded your lifestyle." Chris looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support from our parents, but Dad was still staring at the floor, and Mom was openly weeping. "You're all insane," he said finally. "This is extortion." "No," Uncle Mark corrected. "This is justice. You have 60 days to make this right, or we involve the authorities." Chris stormed out of the room, shouting for Jennifer and Tommy to pack immediately. Within an hour, they were gone, leaving behind a house full of broken relationships and painful truths. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I'd stood up for my children's future instead of just accepting whatever scraps my family decided to throw our way. The fight was just beginning, but at least now it was a fair fight. The aftermath of our confrontation was swift and brutal. Within 2 hours of Chris storming out of my parents' house, my phone was buzzing with calls from family members, friends, and even some of Chris's colleagues who had apparently been contacted in his desperation to control the narrative. The first call came from my cousin Rachel in Detroit. "Lou, what the hell is going on? Chris just called me screaming about false accusations and family betrayal." I explained the situation calmly, reading directly from the bank statements when necessary. Rachel's response was immediate and furious. "Are you telling me that Uncle Joe and Aunt Dorothy stole your inheritance to pay for Chris's house?" $220,000 of it, yes." "That son of a—" Rachel's voice trailed off. "Lou, I'm so sorry. We always wondered how Chris could afford such an expensive lifestyle on his salary." The next call was from my father, his voice shaking with what sounded like a mixture of fear and anger. "Lou, you need to stop this madness right now. Chris is threatening to cut all contact with the family if you don't drop these accusations." "Good," I replied. "Maybe the family will be better off without someone who steals from children." He's not stealing from children. That money was sitting in an account doing nothing. Dad, that money was supposed to pay for Sarah and Jake's college educations. It was supposed to be their security net. Instead, it paid for Tommy's private school and Chris's kitchen renovation. There was a long pause before Dad spoke again. "We always planned to pay it back, Lou. We just needed time." 15 years wasn't enough time. Another pause. "Chris said he'd pay it all back once his business really took off." "What business? He works for someone else's company. He doesn't have a business." He said he was going to start his own consulting firm. He needed seed money to get established. The lies were so transparent, so obviously desperate that I almost felt sorry for my father. Almost. "Dad, Chris has been telling you what you wanted to hear, so you'd keep giving him money. There was never going to be any repayment." That evening, Emma and I sat at our kitchen table with Uncle Mark planning our next steps. He'd brought additional legal documentation and was explaining our options in detail. Realistically, criminal prosecution would be difficult because your parents genuinely believed they were borrowing the money temporarily, he said. But civil recovery is almost certain. We have ironclad evidence of unauthorized use of inheritance funds. "What about Chris?" Emma asked. "He clearly knew he was stealing." Chris presents a stronger criminal case because he knowingly participated in the fraud and actively encouraged your parents to continue the transfers. The emails where he specifically requests money from Lou's portion are particularly damning. How long would this process take? Civil recovery could be resolved within 6 months if they cooperate. Criminal charges, if we pursue them, could take years to work through the system. I thought about Sarah and Jake upstairs trying to sleep while processing the emotional trauma of having their Christmas wishes given to their cousin. The idea of years of legal battles felt exhausting. I want to try private resolution first, I decided. Give them a chance to make this right without involving the courts. That's generous of you, Lou, but we need to set clear deadlines and consequences. People like Chris only respond to real pressure. The next morning brought a development I hadn't expected. Grandma Betty called to tell me that Chris had visited her apartment at 6 a.m., demanding that she destroy her financial records and retract her statement about the inheritance theft. He was quite aggressive, she said, her voice shaky. He said I was a senile old woman who didn't understand complex financial arrangements. What did you tell him? I told him that I might be old, but I'm not stupid, and that I've been keeping detailed financial records since before he was born. Then I called your Uncle Mark and asked him to come over. Are you okay, Grandma? I'm fine, honey, but Chris is desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things. You need to be careful. That afternoon, I received a phone call that I'd been dreading. Jennifer, Chris's wife, was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Lou, please, she sobbed. Chris is talking about bankruptcy and losing the house. He says you're trying to destroy our family over money. Jennifer, I'm trying to recover money that was stolen from my children. Surely you can understand wanting to protect your child's future. But Tommy didn't do anything wrong. Why should he suffer because of adult mistakes? Sarah and Jake didn't do anything wrong either, but they've been suffering for 15 years, while Tommy enjoyed the benefits of their stolen inheritance. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know the money was coming from you. Chris told me his parents were helping us out of generosity. What did you think when they paid for Tommy's private school but never offered to help with Sarah and Jake's education? There was a long silence before Jennifer spoke again. I thought they just loved Tommy more because we lived far away and visits were special. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes with Jennifer alternating between begging me to drop the matter and expressing genuine shock about the scope of the financial deception. By the end, I believed that she truly hadn't known where the money was coming from, which made me feel slightly less angry toward her. But my sympathy for Jennifer didn't extend to Chris. That evening, he called me directly, and the conversation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my brother. Lou, you need to back down immediately, he said without preamble. I've spoken with an attorney, and what you're doing constitutes harassment and extortion. What I'm doing is recovering stolen property. Your attorney should have explained the difference. That money was freely given by our parents. There was no theft. Chris, I have copies of emails where you specifically request advances from my portion of the inheritance. You can't claim ignorance when we have written evidence of your knowledge. Those emails were taken out of context. What context makes Dad I need another $40,000 from Lou's portion acceptable? Chris's voice turned to ugly. You want to know the truth, Lou Fine? Mom and Dad knew that you'd never amount to anything. You were always the underachiever, always satisfied with mediocrity. They invested that money in me because they knew I could make something of myself. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night, that stealing from children is justified because you're special? I didn't steal anything. I used family resources to build a successful life which benefits everyone in the long run. How does your success benefit Sarah and Jake? It shows them what's possible when someone actually applies themselves instead of settling for a working-class lifestyle. The contempt in his voice was breathtaking. Chris genuinely believed that my children were better served by poverty and disappointment than by having their inheritance intact, because watching his success from a distance was supposedly inspirational. You have 58 days left, Chris. Pay back the money or face the consequences. Go to hell, Lou. I'm not giving you a penny. He hung up, but I felt strangely calm. Chris's refusal to even acknowledge the harm he'd caused confirmed that legal action would be necessary. The next week brought a series of escalating incidents. Chris began calling extended family members and former friends, trying to rally support for his version of events. Most people were horrified when they learned the truth. but a few seemed to buy into his narrative about family disputes and misunderstandings. My parents attempted various forms of emotional manipulation. Mom called crying about how I was destroying the family over money. Dad tried the angry approach, demanding that I respect my elders and stop causing drama. When neither strategy worked, they recruited my Aunt Susan to intervene on their behalf. "Lou, surely you can work something out without involving lawyers," Aunt Susan pleaded during an uncomfortable phone conversation. "Your parents are elderly, and this stress could affect their health." "Aunt Susan, they stole my children's college funds to pay for Chris's house. Would you accept that if it happened to your grandchildren?" "But they're family." "Family members don't steal from each other's children." The conversation ended with Aunt Susan promising to pray for a peaceful resolution, which I interpreted as her way of avoiding taking sides. Meanwhile, Uncle Mark was making progress on the legal front. He'd filed preliminary paperwork for civil recovery and had begun the process of documenting every fraudulent transaction. The evidence was overwhelming, but Chris continued to maintain his innocence publicly, while privately pressuring family members to convince me to drop the matter. The breaking point came exactly 2 weeks after our initial confrontation. I arrived home from work to find Emma in the kitchen, furious and shaking. "Chris was here," she said immediately. "What do you mean he was here?" "He came to the house while you were at work. He tried to convince me that you were having some kind of emotional breakdown and that pursuing this inheritance thing was a sign that you needed professional help. He came to our house. He stood in our living room and told me that good wives support their husbands by talking sense into them when they're making destructive decisions. He said I should convince you to drop this before you embarrass the family further." I felt my blood pressure rising. Chris coming to my workplace or calling me directly was one thing, but involving Emma and potentially exposing my children to his manipulation crossed a line. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to get out of our house before I called the police. Then I told him that anyone who steals Christmas presents from children doesn't get to lecture me about family values." "Did the kids see him?" "No, thank God. They were still at school, but Lou, we can't have him showing up here unexpectedly. What if Sarah and Jake had been home?" That evening, I called Uncle Mark and requested an immediate escalation of our legal strategy. Chris's visit to our home constituted harassment and potentially intimidation, which strengthened our case significantly. "I think it's time to file criminal charges," Uncle Mark advised. "Chris is clearly not going to cooperate with voluntary repayment, and his behavior is becoming increasingly erratic." "Do it," I said without hesitation. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and a voicemail box full of panicked messages from my parents, Chris and Jennifer. The police had contacted Chris the previous evening to inform him that criminal charges were being filed for financial fraud and elder abuse. The final message was from Chris himself, and his tone had completely changed from confident to desperate. "Lou, we need to talk immediately. I think there might be a way to work this out that benefits everyone. Call me back as soon as you get this message." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand in dealing with my brother. Chris's arrogance had finally collided with the reality of legal consequences, and he was beginning to understand that his actions had serious implications. But I wasn't ready to negotiate yet. Chris needed to fully comprehend that stealing from children wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding. It was a crime, and criminals face consequences. The reckoning was far from over, but at least now Chris understood that I was serious about protecting my children's future, no matter what it cost me personally. The criminal charges changed everything. Within 48 hours of Uncle Mark filing the paperwork, the entire dynamic of our family conflict shifted from private drama to public legal matter. Chris went from defiant to desperate. My parents transitioned from angry to terrified. And I found myself in the surreal position of potentially sending family members to prison. The first indication of how serious things had become was a call from Detective Sarah Martinez, of the Grand Rapids Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Mr. Williams, I'm calling to inform you that we're opening an investigation into the allegations of financial fraud involving your family members. We'll need to schedule an interview with you to review the evidence. How long does this process typically take? Given the amount of money involved and the duration of the alleged fraud, this could take several months to fully investigate. Financial crimes of this scope are taken very seriously by our department. That afternoon, Chris called me 6 times before I finally answered. His voice was shaking with what sounded like genuine fear. Lou, you have to drop these charges immediately. Do you have any idea what this could do to my career? I imagine it would be devastating, I replied calmly, much like what stealing my children's inheritance did to their future. This is insane. You're talking about sending family members to prison over money. I'm talking about holding criminals accountable for their actions. The fact that their family members doesn't give them immunity from consequences. Lou, please, I'm begging you. I'll pay back some of the money if you drop the charges. But some of the money? I'll pay back $50,000 immediately. Chris, you stole $220,000 from my children. $50,000 isn't even a quarter of what you owe. It's all I can manage right now without losing the house. Then you should have thought about that before stealing from children. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes with Chris offering increasingly desperate compromises. He'd pay back the money in installments over 10 years. He'd sign a confession letter apologizing for his actions. He'd even agree to supervised visitation with his own parents to ensure no further financial abuse occurred. But every compromise he offered was designed to minimize his consequences, rather than address the actual harm he'd caused. He wanted forgiveness without accountability, resolution without justice. You have until Friday to present a complete repayment plan, I told him finally. Full restitution plus interest delivered within 90 days. Anything less, and the criminal charges proceed. That's impossible, Lou. I don't have access to that kind of money. Then you should have thought about that 15 years ago. 2 days later, I received a call that I'd been dreading. Mom was crying so hard she could barely speak. Lou, honey, please come to the house. Your father is in the hospital. What happened? He had chest pains this morning. The doctors think it's stress-related, but they're running tests to make sure it's not a heart attack. I felt a stab of guilt, wondering if the pressure from the criminal charges had triggered Dad's medical emergency. But Emma reminded me that the stress was a result of his own criminal actions, not my decision to pursue justice. If your father is genuinely ill, that's tragic, she said. But it doesn't change the fact that he participated in stealing our children's inheritance. We drove to the hospital in Grand Rapids where I found Dad connected to monitors and looking older than his 68 years. He was awake and alert, but his face was pale and drawn. Son, he said weakly when he saw me enter the room, I'm glad you came. How are you feeling, Like a foolish old man who made terrible decisions and hurt people he loves. It was the first time Dad had acknowledged the harm caused by his actions, and I felt my anger soften slightly. The doctors say it wasn't a heart attack, Mom interjected. Just stress and high blood pressure. But Lou, this has been so hard on him, on both of us. I'm sorry Dad is sick, I said carefully, but that doesn't change what needs to happen with the stolen money. I know, Dad replied quietly, and you're right to pursue it. Chris convinced us that we were helping family, but we knew deep down that what we were doing was wrong. Then why did you keep doing it, y'all? Dad closed his eyes for a long moment before answering. Because Chris threatened to cut all contact if we didn't help him financially. He said he'd make sure we never saw Tommy again. And because we told ourselves we'd pay the money back eventually. Dad, you borrowed against my portion for 15 years. When exactly were you planning to pay it back? Wiki? We thought Chris would become successful enough to repay us, and then we'd put the money back into your account before you needed it. The plan was so naive, so obviously flawed, that I felt almost embarrassed for my father. Chris had manipulated 2 elderly people into funding his lifestyle by exploiting their desire to maintain contact with their grandson. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "We're going to sell the farm," Dad said quietly. "It's worth about $400,000 now. After paying off the mortgage and closing costs, we should have enough to repay your inheritance with interest." I felt a complex mix of emotions about the farm sale. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, and losing it felt like losing our history. But it was also justice for Sarah and Jake, who deserved the financial security that had been stolen from them. "What about Chris?" I asked. "Chris will have to face whatever consequences come from his actions. We can't protect him anymore." That evening, I met with Uncle Mark to discuss the implications of my father's hospitalization and the farm sale proposal. Voluntary restitution would definitely influence the prosecutor's decision about criminal charges, he explained. "If your parents demonstrate genuine remorse and make full repayment, the district attorney might agree to probation instead of jail time." What about Chris? Chris is more problematic. He's shown no remorse, made no effort at restitution, and has actively tried to intimidate witnesses. The prosecutor is likely to pursue jail time for him, regardless of what your parents do. How much jail time are we talking about? For financial fraud of this scope, probably 18 months to 3 years, plus restitution and fines. The idea of Chris serving prison time felt surreal, but I reminded myself that his actions warranted serious consequences. He'd stolen my children's future to fund his own family's privileged lifestyle, then tried to cover it up through intimidation and lies. Friday arrived with a flurry of frantic phone calls. Chris had apparently spent the week trying to liquidate assets and arrange loans, but he was unable to produce even half of the stolen inheritance amount. "I can get you $100,000 by the end of next week," he offered during our final negotiation call. "That's more than a third of what I allegedly owe." "What you allegedly owe, Chris? We have bank statements showing exactly how much you stole. There's nothing alleged about it." "Fine, what I owe. But $100,000 is a substantial amount. Surely that demonstrates good faith." Good faith would have been not stealing from children in the first place. "Lou, be practical. If you send me to prison, you'll get nothing. If you accept my offer, you'll get $100,000 immediately and my commitment to pay the rest over time." "Your commitment means nothing, Chris. You've been lying to me for 15 years. "Then what do you want?" "I want full restitution within 90 days, as I've stated repeatedly." "That's impossible." "Then you'll go to prison." Chris hung up without another word, and I knew our negotiation period was over. The following Monday brought news that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire situation. Jennifer called me crying and barely coherent. "Lou, I'm leaving Chris," she sobbed. "I can't stay married to someone who steals from children and then lies about it." "Jennifer, I'm sorry this has affected your marriage." "No, you don't understand. I found more evidence. Chris has been hiding money in accounts I didn't know about. He's been planning to declare bankruptcy to avoid paying you back, but he's actually hidden enough assets to cover most of the debt." "What kind of evidence?" "Bank statements from offshore accounts, investment portfolios, and false names. Lou, I think Chris has been planning this for months, maybe longer." The revelation that Chris had been actively hiding assets while pleading poverty was the final straw. He wasn't just a thief. He was a sophisticated financial criminal who had tried to use bankruptcy fraud to avoid accountability. "Jennifer, would you be willing to provide that evidence to the prosecutors?" "Yes. And Lou, I'm also leaving him with sole custody of Tommy. Chris has created such a toxic environment that I think my son would be better off away from all this." What will you do?" "I'm moving back to my parents' house in Ohio. I'm going to start over and try to rebuild a life based on honesty instead of lies." That conversation convinced me that pursuing criminal charges had been the right decision. Chris wasn't a family member who had made mistakes. He was a career criminal who had systematically defrauded his own relatives while planning additional crimes to avoid consequences. The next phase would be the most difficult part of the entire ordeal. But at least now I knew we were fighting for justice, not just revenge. 6 months after that devastating Christmas morning, I stood in the lobby of the Grand Rapids courthouse, holding a cashier's check for $347,000. The amount represented my full inheritance plus 15 years of accumulated interest finally recovered after the most painful family conflict I'd ever experienced. The farm sale had closed the previous week, with my parents using the proceeds to make complete restitution as part of their plea agreement. Dad had recovered from his stress-related medical episode, and both my parents had pled guilty to financial elder abuse in exchange for 5 years of supervised probation. They would avoid jail time, but their financial activities would be monitored closely to prevent future abuse. Chris's situation had resolved very differently. Jennifer's evidence of hidden assets had convinced the prosecutor to pursue enhanced charges, and Chris was currently serving a 2-year sentence in federal prison for financial fraud and bankruptcy fraud. The offshore accounts Jennifer discovered contained enough money to cover an additional $40,000 in restitution, which would be directed towards Sarah and Jake's college funds. Tommy was living with Jennifer's parents in Cincinnati and thriving in a more stable environment. Jennifer had started working as a school administrator and was slowly rebuilding her life. She sent regular updates about Tommy's progress and always included messages apologizing for the years of stolen Christmas mornings and missed opportunities that her son had unknowingly benefited from. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked, squeezing my hand as we walked toward Uncle Mark's office for our final legal meeting. "I think so, I replied, though the entire situation still felt surreal. Uncle Mark was waiting with a stack of paperwork that would formally close all legal proceedings related to the inheritance theft. He looked pleased but tired after months of navigating complex financial fraud cases. "Lou, I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage," he said as we settled into chairs around his conference table. "Most people would have accepted the theft rather than confront family members about financial crimes. I couldn't let Sarah and Jake grow up thinking they didn't deserve the same opportunities as their cousin." "Well, they'll have those opportunities now. With proper investment, this inheritance could fund their college educations and provide a substantial foundation for their adult lives." We spent an hour reviewing the final settlements and discussing investment strategies for the recovered funds. Uncle Mark recommended conservative approaches that would preserve the money's value, while generating modest returns over the next decade. "What about your relationship with your parents?" he asked as we concluded the paperwork. "We're working on it," I replied honestly. "They're attending family therapy and we've started having supervised visits with the kids. It's going to take time to rebuild trust, but I think we'll get there eventually." "And Chris will have to live with the consequences of his choices. When he gets out of prison in 18 months, he'll need to figure out how to rebuild his life without stealing from family members." The drive home from the courthouse felt like the end of a long, exhausting journey. Emma and I had decided not to tell Sarah and Jake the full details of the legal proceedings, but we had explained that Grandpa and Grandma had made mistakes with money that belonged to our family, and that those mistakes were being corrected. "Will we be rich now?" Sarah had asked when we mentioned the inheritance recovery. "We'll be secure," I had replied, "which means you and Jake won't have to worry about paying for college, and Mommy and I won't have to work extra jobs to afford the things you need." That evening, we gathered in our living room for a family meeting that had been months in the making. Sarah and Jake sat on the couch between Emma and me, both of them curious about the serious tone of the conversation. "Do you remember Christmas morning at Grandpa and Grandma's house?" I began carefully. "When Tommy got all our presents," Jake said immediately. "That's right. And do you remember how sad and confused you felt?" Both children nodded, their expressions growing serious. "Well, it turns out that what happened wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Some adults in our family made very bad choices that hurt you, and we've been working to fix those choices." "Are Grandpa and Grandma in trouble?" Sarah asked. "They had to face consequences for their bad choices, yes, but they're also working very hard to make things right with our family." I pulled out 2 college savings account statements that we'd opened with the first portion of the recovered inheritance funds. Each account showed a balance of $50,000 designated specifically for Sarah and Jake's future educational expenses. "This money belongs to you," I explained, showing them the statements. "It will help pay for college when you're older, or trade school, or whatever education you decide you want to pursue." Jake stared at the numbers on the paper. $50,000? That's more money than I've ever seen. "It's money that should have been saved for you all along," Emma added. "Money that will make sure you have the same opportunities as any other children in our family." "What about Tommy?" Sarah asked. "Does he have money saved for college too?" "Tommy's situation is different now," I replied. "His parents are getting divorced, and he's living with different family members who are taking good care of him." "Is he okay?" Sarah's concern for her cousin, despite everything that had happened, reminded me why fighting for her future had been so important. "He's doing well. He's in a good school and has people who love him taking care of him." We spent the next hour talking about the importance of honesty in families, the difference between mistakes and deliberate harmful choices, and the concept of consequences for bad decisions. Both children seemed to grasp that serious wrongs had been committed against them, but they also understood that justice had been served. "Will we still see Grandpa and Grandma?" Jake asked. "Yes, but the visits will be different for a while. We'll all spend time together, but there will be other adults there to make sure everyone is safe and honest with each other." "Do they still love us?" Sarah's question broke my heart. "Yes, sweetheart. They love you very much. Sometimes people who love us still make bad choices that hurt us. And when that happens, we have to be very careful about how we rebuild trust." 6 months later, our family had settled into a new normal that felt healthier and more secure than anything we'd experienced before. The inheritance money had allowed Emma to return to school for her teaching degree, and I'd been able to start my own woodworking business with proper equipment and workspace. Sarah and Jake were thriving. Sarah had joined a dance class she'd always wanted to try, and Jake was receiving specialized tutoring for his learning disabilities. Both children seemed more confident and secure knowing that their future education was protected. My relationship with my parents was slowly improving. They were attending weekly therapy sessions and had made genuine efforts to understand how their favoritism had damaged both their grandchildren and our family relationships. The supervised visits had evolved into longer, more natural gatherings where they demonstrated consistent respect for boundaries and honest communication. Grandma Betty had become a regular fixture in our household, often babysitting the kids and sharing stories about family history that didn't involve financial deception. She frequently commented on how much happier and more relaxed Sarah and Jake seemed compared to previous years. The community response to our situation had been overwhelmingly supportive. Several neighbors and family friends had shared their own stories of financial abuse and family favoritism, creating a network of people who understood the complex emotions involved in holding family members accountable for harmful actions. Chris remained in prison, and I'd had no contact with him since his sentencing. Jennifer sent occasional updates indicating that he was participating in financial responsibility counseling and claiming to understand the harm his actions had caused. Whether his apparent remorse was genuine or simply strategic remained to be seen. Tommy had adjusted well to his new living situation and was excelling in school. Jennifer made sure he understood that the gifts he'd received at Christmas had belonged to his cousins, and he'd written heartfelt apology letters to Sarah and Jake. The children had forgiven him completely, understanding that he hadn't known about the deception. 1 year after the inheritance recovery, we hosted our own Christmas celebration at our house, inviting Grandma Betty, Uncle Mark, and Aunt Carol and Jennifer with Tommy. The atmosphere was warm and genuine, in a way that our family gatherings had never been before. Sarah and Jake opened presents that they'd actually asked for, that we'd been able to afford because of their recovered inheritance. But more importantly, they opened gifts in an environment of honesty and security, surrounded by adults who demonstrated through their actions that children deserve protection and respect. "Daddy," Sarah said as we cleaned up wrapping paper that evening, "this was the best Christmas ever." Why Why is that, sweetheart? Because everyone was nice to everyone and nobody was sad or scared. Her simple observation captured everything I'd been fighting for. Children deserve to feel safe and valued in their families. They deserve to trust that adults will protect their interests and treat them fairly. They deserve to grow up knowing that justice exists and that people who hurt them will face appropriate consequences. The inheritance money had provided financial security, but the real victory was creating a family environment based on honesty and accountability, rather than favoritism and deception. Sarah and Jake would grow up understanding that they deserved respect and protection, and that lesson was worth far more than any amount of money. As I tucked my children into bed that night, I realized that the worst Christmas of our lives had ultimately led to the best changes we could have imagined. Sometimes protecting the people you love requires taking actions that feel impossible, but the alternative is accepting injustice and teaching children that their welfare doesn't matter. Standing up for Sarah and Jake had cost me relationships and caused tremendous stress, but it had also given my children something invaluable: the knowledge that their father would fight for them no matter the cost, and that they lived in a world where right and wrong actually mattered. The inheritance was just money. The real treasure was a family built on truth, justice, and genuine love. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right for your children? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept harmful behavior, even when it comes from people we care about. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how you've handled difficult family situations where children's welfare was at stake. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for what's right. Share this with anyone who might need encouragement to protect their children from family dysfunction. Remember, you're not responsible for other people's choices, but you are responsible for protecting your children's future. Thank you for listening to my family's story, and I hope it reminds you that justice is worth fighting for, especially when it comes to protecting the people who depend on us most. Wishing you and your family security, honesty, and genuine love in all your relationships.